In response to his repeated apology, Labour Party leader Sir Keir Starmer called on the Prime Minister to resign and described the apology as a joke. After initially facing heckles from Tory benches, the Labour leader then silenced the Commons when he told an emotional story about a man from Lichfield. Let's take a listen.
This morning, I spoke to John Robinson, a constituent of the member for Lichfield. I want to tell you his story. When his wife died of COVID, John and his family obeyed the Prime Minister's rules. He didn't see her in hospital. He didn't hold her hand as she died. But John would have given the world to hold his dying wife's hand, even if it was just for 9 minutes. But he didn't, because he followed the Prime Minister's rules.
Well, at that moment, you could have heard a pin drop in the House of Commons. Clearly, an emotional moment, and indeed one that the MP for that constituent, Mr Michael Fabricant, addressed later in the House as well. I'm delighted to say that Michael Fabricant joins me on the programme now, of course, the Conservative MP for Lichfield. Michael, just to start off, how did you feel when Sir Keir Starmer named you in his response?
Well, he named me twice. I was bemused that, you know, at the end of the day, I'm a backbencher. Twice in his speech he mentioned me. He mentioned me earlier on, and then he mentioned me a second time, and I was surprised. I mean, I sort of remember looking down and thinking, my God, you know, he's obsessed with me. I've got under his skin. I don't know why, because I don't think I've been any more voluble about things than other people, so I was very surprised, but sad to hear about John Robinson.
You have become known as one of the most fervent defenders of the Prime Minister, popping up on news channels defending the Prime Minister. And one of the defences that you cited was, of course, the fact that it wasn't just the Prime Minister who happened to have a birthday. Other key workers may well have had birthdays. There are some examples publicly available of that. Sir Keir Starmer criticised you of that, saying it was, in effect, an attack on teachers and nurses. What would you say to that?
Yeah, it's not meant to be an attack at all. I mean, first of all, I would say that, you know, people say, oh, the Prime Minister made those rules, he should have understood them. I mean, it has to be said that very, very senior civil servants have also appeared to have broken those rules in the number 10 Downing Street setting. And I think it's because the assumption was made at the time that because they were all working together, they weren't breaking any rules. The point I had made, and I think what Keir Starmer was referring to, was I said that I was aware, and since I said what I said, I've become even more aware because people have written to me about it from all parts of the country, that a few nurses and a few teachers, after a long, gruelling, hard day, met up afterwards. I think they took a similar view, that they'd been working together. I'm not condemning them. In fact, I'm understanding for them. None of them were drunk. I never made that accusation. And yet it seems to have got very out of hand. You know, there are some 500,000 nurses in the UK and 625,000 teachers. So to claim that not one single nurse or not one single teacher broke a technical rule seems to me a bit naive, actually. And it's certainly, as I say, no condemnation of any nurses or teachers who I think have done a very hard and difficult job during the COVID period, all of them.
No, certainly. On this programme earlier in the week, I've spoken about a nurse who was celebrated in the local press for having a birthday party. Her colleagues brought her in a cake. She was working on the wards. It seemed like a nice thing. It's interesting that that's been turned into an attack. But I do want to move this conversation on because, of course, John Robinson was the name that silenced the Commons. It was a horrific story, a man who wasn't able to see a dying loved one. However, I'm not entirely convinced it's an entirely apt comparison to what took place in the 19th of June in the Cabinet Room of Downing Street. For those watching on television, not just listening on radio, we will be able to see on our screens now a graphic from the CPS, which was describing the change in regulations. And indeed, the regulations changed on the 13th of June, a week before that event in the Cabinet Room, saying that individuals may see another person they reasonably believe is dying. They could see that person in a setting of a hospital or a hospice or a home or indeed a care home. Those regulations had changed as part of lockdown easing. Yet, why didn't the Prime Minister mention that?
He probably wasn't aware of it. You know, the rules were constantly changing as the strength of the COVID pandemic ebbed and gained and flowed backwards and forwards, so the legislation had to react. And I know many people were confused by what was actually the legislation at the time. And of course, what was legislation in England was different in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. And as I said, it was simply because, and people criticised it. I saw the press were criticising, why does the government keep chopping and changing with the rules? Why? Because it had to react quickly to the strength of the pandemic. And when it weakened, they made it looser, and when they strengthened. But, you know, I just find the whole thing extraordinary when, as I said, civil servants themselves were attending many of these events in Downing Street and elsewhere, thinking that they weren't breaking the rules. And, you know, 2 years ago, and I think you tweeted about it, Tom, 2 years ago, the Times published an article mentioning the fact that a birthday cake had appeared in the cabinet room. Nobody raised a hue and cry then. It's all happened now. And, you know, the saddest thing of all, I think, is the way that Keir Starmer and other politicians have chosen to weaponise the personal tragedies endured by people like John Robinson. And, you know, I would have thought actually that was pretty beneath him.
It's fascinating to see the very visceral public reaction to all of this. Of course, people hear the word party and they probably think of something quite different to a muted event with people you're in the same room anyway for work purposes. Do you understand how the public perceives so much of this debate, thinking back to the trials and tribulations and indeed the heartache that so many people suffered during it? It almost doesn't wash that whether the regulations had changed by this point or that point, whether this was in Tier 1 or when in shops were opening or when people were allowed to come round for interior decoration or anything else. It almost doesn't matter what the particulars are because people seem to have just decided that there's hypocrisy here.
Yes, it's such an emotional issue, and the word partygate has become, you know, part of our vocabulary. And as you quite rightly say, when I think of a party, I think of people blowing party poppers and drinking and rolling around, you know, with friends and all the rest of it. And it was nothing like that, but people aren't interested in that. But, you know, I think now the strength of feeling is very strong. I suspect as things drift on, you know, we'll move on to other issues. I think most thoughtful people realise this is very different. And I'll say again for a third time, the senior civil servants all thought it was legal. And that's why, incidentally, I will be voting tomorrow to say that I believe that the Prime Minister was not misleading the House because he had been told by his civil servants, the very people who drew up the legislation, what you are doing in Downing Street is perfectly legal, and we're participating too. So, you know, I don't think he has a case to answer as far as misleading the House is concerned. And I'll say one other thing. Chris Bryant, who I have... You know, I'm very fond of Chris Bryant. He and I were on a committee for a long time together. But some of the things that Chris has tweeted about the Prime Minister doesn't bear repeating.
And he would be adjudicating this case.
He is the chairman of the committee that will be voting on tomorrow. You know, this is not an unbiased judge. So apart from the fact that I don't personally believe he misled the House anyway, because he was taking civil servants' advice, to give it to a committee chaired by Chris Bryant and some of the other people who've already made their views clear would, to me, be a nonsense and a miscarriage of justice.
Well, it will be fascinating to see how that vote goes through. Of course, tomorrow we're expecting it. Today we're expecting to see the wording of that Labour motion. But for now, Michael Fabricant, thank you so much for talking us through that fascinating day yesterday in Parliament.